Well, we've got 3 chapters left here in our studies in Genesis, 5, 10, and 11. We're going to take them 3 tonight and begin looking at that chapter. It's a remarkable document from history, one of the most remarkable documents of history that we have. With us today. So if you'll open your Bible to Genesis 10, 32 verses. Of course, it's that chapter here with all of the names in it. And we're going to be looking sooner or later, I doubt we'll get to that many of them tonight, but sooner or later at most of the names here and try to trace some things. You remember from Old Testament, what's the name of this chapter? What is it generally spoken of? Table of Nations. And that means that a lot of these names that we have here in the chapter are going to somehow be connected to a series of nations, which is what makes it such a remarkable early document, because there's nothing like this in the field of old literature today. Now, we were closing up last week with the end of chapter 9 and looking at the prophecy, verses 18 through 29, that Noah gave concerning his 3 sons. Verse 25, the curse was placed on Canaan. We'll see him here in our current chapter over verse 6. He's the last name there in verse 6, so he'll come up again there, as well as you see him down in verse 15, verse 18, verse 19. As a matter of fact, he, along with Nimrod, are given the major portions of any large section here in chapter 10, Canaan and Nimrod. Nimrod actually has a lot of information about him individually. There in verses 15 through 18, it simply mentions Canaan as being the father of Sidon, Heth, Jebusite, Amorite, and so forth. So anyway, back 9:25, he's the one who was cursed here. Verse 26, then Shem is blessed as far as being the one who is going to provide the spiritual blessings for the whole human race, with Canaan being the provider. Of course, this, as we showed you, refers to all of the Hamites, would be the provider of material goods and well-being. And verse 27, Japheth would be the provider of the intellectual welfare of the whole human race. And for the most part, you see, remember that there may be some exceptions here where you get a spiritual Hamite and you get an intellectual Shemite. There may be individual exceptions, but for the most part, the prophecy here has been true to detail as far as history has proven out since then. The general characteristics, when they're spoken of Canaan, or really of the Hamites, then of the Shemites, then of the Japhethites, when it speaks of these general characteristics, they have been generally true for most, not all, but most of the descendants of these 3 early sons of Noah. Now, in all the places where the names occur together, Shem, Ham, Japheth, they always occur in that order, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, although that has nothing to do with who is the oldest, as we showed you last week. So we ask the question, first of all, why, when the names appear together, are they always in that order? Must be a reason, since it's certainly not firstborn, secondborn, thirdborn. There must be a particular reason why the authors here of Genesis, as well as the author of First Chronicles, would have placed them in this order. Well, you could think of answers yourself, but the most obvious and probable likely answer is the fact that Shem, biblically speaking, is the most important of the 3 sons, because through Shem, Israel is going to come, and finally Israel's Messiah. So that answers why Shem is placed first. Then what about the reversal now of Japheth and Ham? Well, the Hamites would come into closer geographical relation and connection with the Shemites than would the Japhethites. And since all of the Old Testament, which of course is most of the Bible, is concerned with Israel, and therefore the Shemites in a narrow sense of the word, since that's true, then of course Ham is going to come next of all, because we don't see Americans or any other type of people that don't come into contact with Israel in the Old Testament, just a lot of these nations that are descended from the Hamites, such as, you get down there in verses 15 through 18, look at the names, Jebusite, Amorite, Girgasite, and so forth. These are all descendants from Ham, because Ham's genealogy starts back in verse 6 of chapter 10. So it's because of the close geographical connection between the Hamites and the Shemites that Shem would come first, Ham second, Japheth third. However, remember in chapter 10 here, the order is not that way. The order is Japheth, then Ham, and then Shem. And the same thing is true in 1 Chronicles. And again, here we can ask the question, why? Again, it's not according to age. Japheth is first, but Shem and Ham are reversed now. So we've got to come up with another reason on why they would be in this particular order. Well, obviously, Japheth, being the oldest, the elder of the three brothers, is going to be put first in a formal genealogical enumerational list, like what we have here in Genesis 10 and 1 Chronicles 1. Since he's the eldest and it's a formal list, it's not speaking now spiritually of Shem being the most important, but it's a formal genealogical list, and the oldest is going to come first. What about Ham and Shem, though? Again, they're reversed. Well, probably Shem is placed last because the author wants to lead right into the story of Abraham, and if he would have put Shem second and then Ham, then he'd have to get through discussing Ham and go back to Shem all over again. In other words, it would break the continuity of the narrative here, unless you go ahead and put Shem last, since all the rest of the Old Testament is going to be concerned with Shem and his descendants. So that's why we have Japheth first, then Ham, then Shem down in verse 21. Then we do have a parenthetical break in chapter 11, verses 1 through 9. But then notice verse 10, he picks right up with Shem again. Now, since Shem was the last one dealt with in chapter 10, that only makes sense, that he's going to be picking up with Shem again, and he follows Shem all the way down until he gets to Abram, and then he follows that all the way through the rest of the Old Testament. So that answers the question, why in the first place, when the three names occur together, it's always Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and in the second place, why it happens to be Japheth, Ham, and Shem here in Genesis 10. I believe the verses in 1 Chronicles are verses 5 through 23 of 1 Chronicles 1. Now, you need to keep in mind also, just introduction, we're just trying to get the chapter here introduced because, well, it's difficult because of all the names that we have here, which obviously is going to make it a little difficult. I don't know how you're going to get your chapter 10 divided up, but I had to work out a system in order to be able to recognize things the way they flow here, because we've got various interruptions that occur. But anyway, chapters 9, 10, and 11 are not given to us in straight chronological order. In the end of chapter 9, verse 29, Noah's dying now at 950. But he certainly must have lived some into chapter 10 in order to see some of his grandsons, great-grandsons, great-great-grandsons. How far down the list we go, we don't know. But since he lived 350 years after the beginning of the flood, certainly he lived into chapter 10. Again, using verse 6 as a basis, Ham is his son, but Cush, Mizraim, Put, and Canaan are grandsons. Now, if he didn't live to see them, that means they weren't born to Ham until 350 years after the flood. But if you look over in chapter 11 and verse 10, Here we've got a son being born to Shem only 1 year after the end of the flood. So it means, in other words, that sons were being born to Noah's sons, which would make them grandsons to him, or shortly after the end of the flood. This is seen in chapter 11 and verse 10. Now, chapter 11, verses 1 to 9 is an interruption, and it doesn't appear as if Noah actually lived to the time of the Tower of Babel. Now, some of his descendants are alive at this time, and we can comment more on that when we cover that genealogy over in the middle of chapter 11, because if you count that genealogy from verses 10 through 26 of chapter 11, it would appear as though Noah lived all the way down to the time of Abram. But of course we know that he didn't. And it certainly doesn't seem likely that Noah would have been a participant in this rebellion here in the first 9 verses of chapter 11. So that just shows you that some things are before others and some come after. Like this passage here in the first 9 verses of chapter 11, that fits back in chapter 10, with some of chapter 10 coming before 11, 1 through 9, and the rest of chapter 10 coming after 11, 1 through 9. In other words, the Tower of Babel doesn't just follow chapter 10 chronologically. It fits back into chapter 10. And we'll show you where it fits in another connection here. Now what I want to do this evening is look at 2 subjects. As long as we got time to get through these 2, we want to look at a summary of the contents of chapter 10 and a summary of the purpose of chapter 10. And if we have time, we can go on from there. But a summary of the contents and a summary of the purpose. Now probably you've already read this at home before. It doesn't make any difference. You might not have gotten a lot out of it since it's filled with nothing but a lot of names, but we'll try to give you some background information to introduce you to the Table of Nations. Okay, first of all, under a summary of contents, which means just that, we're going to summarize the contents here. We're not going to do a detailed study yet, anyway, of the names. First of all, chapter 10 of Genesis is the only accurate account of the origin of the nations to be found anywhere. Which means that it's no small chapter in the Bible. This would make it, in that regard, the most important historical genealogical chapter in all of the Bible, both Old and New Testament. Now, not necessarily the most important genealogical chapter, but historical genealogical chapter in giving us a history of peoples and nations and tongues and political empires and so forth, as opposed to individuals. We'll answer the question about who's an individual here and who's a group of people later. So that makes chapter 10 in the Bible unique, not only in the Bible, but in all extant human literature. There's never been anything found that even approximates what we've been given here in Genesis 10. Now, there are lists among the Babylonians and among the Egyptians of ancient peoples, but generally it's only ancient kings and leaders of their own particular nationality. It doesn't go into great detail as far as telling us about all the nations that are spread out all over the earth. So it makes Genesis 10 very unique, and it has to really come here in Genesis because it's going to prepare us for the rest of the Bible, as well as, like I said last week, the rest of human history, because we've all descended through one of these great variety of names here in chapter 10. Everyone here, everyone in the world, as a matter of fact, has come through one of these names here. So it's interesting that it's unique not only in the Bible, but in all of the records from ancient human history. Secondly, regarding the contents, it speaks only of Caucasian people to begin with. Noah was a Caucasian man, as were his 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, or Japheth, Ham, and Shem, as we have in this chapter. So, in the beginning, it speaks only of Caucasian peoples. And we're just introducing it. We'll come back to these points at a later time and expound upon them some more as far as when does the Caucasian line traceable from one of these three sons come to an end. You see, all three sons are Caucasian to begin with. But we know that everyone in the world today is not Caucasian. So something happened somewhere along the way in one of these lines to change that part of the line. Now, we're not actually told here in chapter 10 when that took place. All we are given is the fact that, to begin with, the peoples here that are spoken of are Caucasians. In the third place, chapter 10 places the post-Diluvian population of men in Mesopotamia before they began to spread out. The post-Diluvian population of men are placed in Mesopotamia before they began to spread out. Now, if you'll turn back to chapter 2, that's post-Diluvian. This is antediluvian in chapter 2, and the same thing is true here. In other words, the origin of the human race is in Mesopotamia. What today, of course, is known as Iran and Iraq, the same place where these two countries are today was ancient Mesopotamia. And so this, we can't claim, people in Europe can't claim, people in Asia can't claim that they have the region within the bounds of their continent where all of humanity began. Wow. Only the people in Iran and Iraq can claim to have that particular area. And this is in Mesopotamia. And the people that happen to live in Iran are a very, very ancient people as far as a single line of people where they haven't changed and mixed with other peoples to a great degree. Much, much, much older than we Americans are, or than the English or the French or the Germans or anyone like that. They are extremely, extremely old. And of course, eventually they trace themselves way back to Genesis 10. Which we do too, of course, but there's been more intermarriage and mixing of groups of people with us as compared to with them. Chapter 2, verses 13 to 14. Now this is antediluvian record. The name of the second river is Gihon. The same is it that compasseth the whole land of Ethiopia. The name of the third river is Hiddekel, which is the Tigris River, as you can see from over in the book of Daniel, I think, chapter 10. That is it which goeth toward the east of Assyria, and the fourth river is Euphrates. So population begins right here in Mesopotamia prior to the flood. Now, after the flood, chapter 10, we're in the same region, although at the time of the beginning of chapter 10, we're a little bit northwest of there. Now, how do we explain that? That we're a little bit northwest. Well, do you remember the map we showed you where Mount Ararat was and where Armenia was? Well, that's northwest now of the lower Mesopotamian region where Tigris and Euphrates River Valley is at its height. Now, of course, when we get to the end of chapter 10, we are back down in the identical same area, as we'll show you later. So the post-Diluvian population of man is located in Mesopotamia. In the fourth place, the contents here of chapter 10 speak of a great division in the earth, which happens after several generations have come along. More specifically, during the time of the man named Peleg, whom we'll look at in the future. A great division takes place after several generations have come along. Now you see, Peleg is not mentioned here in chapter 10 until way down in verse 25. But over in chapter 11, all you've got to go is from verse 10 down through verse 16. And you've already reached the place now of Peleg. So Peleg occurs in both of these chapters. By the time we get through, you'll be probably familiar with most of these names, and you'll know where they are in our text here. Okay, one other thing about the contents of the chapter concerns the names that we find here in the list. It is a little difficult to determine exactly what is meant by these various names that we are given here, because some of them seem to fit under different categories. Such as in verse 8. It says in verse 6, and the sons of Ham were Cush, Mizraim, Put, and Canaan. And the sons of Cush were Sheba, Havilah, Sabta, Raamah, Sabteka, and the sons of Raamah, Sheba, Dedan. Now that appears to be speaking of sons, because it keeps calling them sons. And in verse 8, we have a good proof, this is one of the best here in our passage, that at least on some accounts, the actual form of the name that we have here in the chapter does refer to a literal human descendant from one of these three forefathers. Notice verse 8, Cush begat Nimrod, and he began to be a mighty one in the earth. So in other words, obviously Nimrod is a man here. He's not a place, he's not a group of people, he's not a capital, he's not a sea, he's not an ocean, he's a man. Now the problem is that doesn't always hold true when we look at all these names. So there's been, of course, a great argument over the fact that the names here don't really refer to individuals because of the connections that are made with some of these names. Look down in verse 13. So verse 8, we see that it does, at least on that account, speak of a man. All right, notice verse 13, it's no longer speaking of a man. Now it is speaking of a group of people. Because with the I am ending, it's plural in the Hebrew. Mizraim, Ludim, Anamim, Lehabim, Naphtuhim. Now it says that Mizraim begat. Well, how can Mizraim begat Ludim? Because here you've got a plurality of people. So in this verse, the name that occurs, what we're discussing now is the names that we find here in the chapter. The names that occur here in verse 13 obviously speak of a group of people. Then in verse 16, the names appear to speak of localized tribes of people. Canaan begat Zidon, his firstborn, Heth, and the Jebusite, and the Amorite, and the Girgasite, the Hivite, the Arkite, the Sinite, the Arvadite, the Zemarite, and the Hamathite. Now in all of these cases, from verse 16 down through 18a, it speaks of a local tribe of people. Then back in verse 7, the name appears to speak of a country, as well as verse 28. The same name occurs in both places. And the sons of Cush, Seba, Havilah, Sabta, Raamah, Sabteka, and the sons of Raamah, Sheba. Well, where have you heard Sheba in the Old Testament? The queen of Sheba. Sheba is a country on the Arabian Peninsula. And she was the queen of that country, and the queen from that country, the queen of Sheba. So here it appears that the name happens to be speaking of a country rather than an individual. Same with verse 28. Obal, Abimael, and Sheba. The name occurs for the second time. Now don't confuse the Sheba with the Seba. The Seba in the beginning of verse 7 is another name. Let's see, there's another one or two here. Back in verse 7, again, the sons of Cush, Seba, and Havilah. Havilah also happens to be a country. Havilah occurs down in verse 29. And by the way, there in the same verse, verse 29, Ophir. Where have you heard of Ophir in the Old Testament? It was a place where the gold was brought from. Back to the kings of Israel, they bought the gold of Ophir back. So Ophir, again, is a country. Then back up in verse 15, if that doesn't confuse you, this tops it all off. And Canaan begat Zidon, his firstborn. Well, what's Zidon in the Old Testament as well as in the New Testament? It's a famous Phoenician seaport. So here Zidon is a city. So we've seen the name refer to a person, a people, a tribe, a country, and finally a city. And it even calls Zidon there his firstborn. So you can't have a firstborn city. All you can have is a firstborn son. So what's our conclusion? Our conclusion is the following. In the very beginning, the original forms of these names, some of which aren't in our text here in Genesis, always referred to literal sons that were born to their father. As time went along, countries, cities, tribes, as well as whole nationalities of people began to adopt certain names of a famous forefather of theirs to speak of those particular things. Now in verse 16, this fellow's name couldn't be Jebusite. That's speaking of a tribe of people. Maybe his name was Jeb. We know that their city in the Old Testament was Jebus. Maybe his name was Jebus. Maybe his name was just Jeb. We don't know what his name was. But it was something that was shorter than Jebusite, but similar to it. And as a result, his descendants picked up his name and called themselves the Jebusites. The Amorites, Girgasites, and so forth. If we go down to verse 28, 29, those people who lived in Sheba, who all were descended, or I should say, first of all, those people who were descended from Sheba ended up naming their country after a famous forefather of theirs, Sheba. The same thing is true with Ophir in verse 29. The same thing is true with Havilah. Back up in verse 13. Again, this is a plurality of people here, a nationality of people, Mizraim. Maybe their father's name was Mizraim or Miz or something like that. And so the people afterwards were known as the Mizraim because they descended from Mizra. And finally, the same thing is true in verse 15. The descendants of Zidon evidently settled right in what we know today, or what they knew then in the Old Testament as Phoenicia, and they settled where that seaport that became called in the Old Testament Zidon, they settled there and named the place after their father. Now, there's nothing so strange with this, because what's the whole name of the people of God in the Bible? Israel. And they are named after an important early forefather of theirs. Not Abraham, not Jacob, but Israel. And as a result, the people today are known as Israel, and the country today is known as Israel. But both of those things came from the name of an early forefather of theirs. Now, you'd probably be surprised on how frequently this has happened in the course of human history. Many, 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 many places. I mean, you know, just in this state. I mean, think of a city that's a person's name. And it was named after an individual. As a matter of fact, that's just the way many of these names of different places have gone on from one generation to another. Certain characteristics of the individual. I mean, these names here that are given on the basis of a characteristic, either one that can be observed or one that is prophetic in the person, such as the name Shem. The name Shem in Hebrew means name or fame. No doubt it was given prophetically to speak of the great fame that would come spiritually to the Shemites. Cush refers to a dark people. And we know this is exactly what happened with the people that became the descendants of Cush. The same is true with Ham. We'll go back to the very beginning. Because Cush came from Ham, the very name Ham means black in Hebrew. We showed you last week from 9:27, where a paronomasia was used, that the name Japheth means to enlarge. And so this was passed down to him and then on to his descendants. In other words, they were named after prophetic characteristics that would come about in the people. In, of course, this case, with these three men, in all three of the instances, it's a prophetic reference because Ham wasn't black whenever he was born, but his descendants, many of them, not all, but many of them became black. And so it was a prophetic name. I mean, your name out there might be Smith. That's because 200, 300, 400 years ago, your ancestor was a blacksmith. And you see, people didn't always have first names, middle names, last names, initials, and juniors, and the thirds, and so forth. You were just known by either your father's name or by some characteristic name of yourself. If your name is Carpenter, your forefathers were carpenters. And there are a lot of different names that you can trace back to something like that. And the same is true here now in chapter 10, where these names of individuals have been passed on to a tribe, to a nationality of people, to a country, or to a particular city. But no doubt in the beginning, the original form of the name, some of which, of course, aren't here in chapter 10, the original form of the name spoke of an individual. That was a son that was born to his father. And then later on, the names were swapped around, things subtracted, things added, and you end up with a whole group of people. Now, I want to show you, if you look in verses 5, 20, and 31, each of these verses form a conclusion to the three divisions of the body of Genesis 10. We have a very interesting fourfold division that shows that we've got many different branches that come out from Shem, Ham, and Japheth, or from Japheth, Ham, and Shem.
For the continued,
we have a very interesting fourfold division that shows that we've got many different branches that come out from Shem, Ham, and Japheth, or from Japheth, Ham, and Shem. This is seen in 5, 20, and 31. Let's take verse 20, for instance. Now notice what it says here. It's been talking about one man and the descendants from this one man, Ham. Verse 20, these are the sons of Ham. Now this is a conclusion to verses 6 through 19. It's summing all of that up. These are the sons of Ham after their families, which speaks of racial characteristics, after their tongues, which speaks of linguistic characteristics, after their countries, which speaks of geographical characteristics, and in their nations, in their countries, in their nations, which speaks of political characteristics. And in each of these three conclusions, you have that fourfold division. Now, it's interesting that if Noah, Shem, Ham, Japheth are all speaking the same language, obviously they are, they couldn't communicate with each other. Notice that by the time we get to verse 20, these descendants of Ham have broken up into families, various racial groups of people, tongues, they speak different languages, which shows obviously that this verse has to come after Genesis 11, verses 1 to 9, because here they all spoke the same tongue. Amen. Shows you right away that verses 1 through 9 of 11 fit back into 10 somewhere. In their countries means they eventually spread out, which also comes after 1 to 9 of chapter 11. This is their geography. And in their nations, their political empires that they set up. Now, whenever in any of these next few weeks we use the term race, we're not using it in the evolutionary sense, where in the evolutionary sense a race is a subspecies. The Bible only speaks of one race, and that's the human race. But there are a great number of families, which is just what he calls it here, families which have derived themselves from the original parent, whether it be Adam or whether it be Noah. So we're just speaking of it as far as the various cultural characteristics as well as the characteristics of the features of the individual. We speak of race, not as something inferior to a higher breed of people, because we're all part of one race, and it's the human race. Now in verse 31, we have similar to what was in verse 20. These are the sons of Shem after their families. Okay, that's back to racial characteristics. After their tongues, linguistic characteristics. The last thing, nations, which was the same in verse 20, political characteristics. And it simply changes countries of verse 20 to lands in verse 31, but it still speaks of geography. Now when we go back to verse 5, that covers, first of all, Ham and then Shem. We go back to verse 5, the second part of that verse, where it reads like the other ones, everyone after his tongue, linguistic, after their families, racial, after their nations, political. But notice, there's not a mentioning now of countries or of lands, like we find in verses 20 and 31. But we can show you where it does appear, so don't think that it's really missing. We'll come back to that later on. Okay, something else we can say about the contents of chapter 10, and that is that no females are given in the list. Now, in other genealogical lists in the Bible, many times females are included, such as in Matthew 1. But here in this account, there are no females. As a result, if you look down in verses 20 through 23, the word translated children there, which implies that it could be, male or female, should be changed back to son, because it's the same Hebrew word that's always translated son everywhere else in the chapter. And for some reason, we get down to these verses, 21, 22, 23, and they want to slip in the word children. And it's not children because it would have to imply females then, and the only names that are given are males. So unto Shem also, the father of all the sons of Eber, the brother of Japheth the elder, even to him were sons born. The sons of Shem: Elam, Asher, Arpachshad, Lud, Aram. The sons of Aram: Uz, Hul, Gether, and Mash. And it's proven by the fact that when you get down to verse 31 and he's summing it up, he said these are the sons. So it's inconsistent. Now he's gone back to sons, whereas he slipped at children about 3 or 4 times there in verses 21, 22, and 23. And then one final thing on contents. We can ask the question, how inclusive is the table of nations for our day as well as for Moses' day? Remember, Moses is the one that wrote this. So how inclusive is the table of nations? Some claim that it's only a representative table of nations which deals with those people into whose contact Israel came in the future. Because there's no mention of the Indians of North America and South America. There's no mention of the Japanese, Korean type people. There's no mention of the Aborigines of New Zealand and the Aborigines of Australia. There's no mention of the Eskimos of the Arctic region. A lot of very important racial groups of people today are missing from the list. So on that basis, some would claim that it's not all inclusive. It's only partly inclusive. And it only speaks of the people in the Mesopotamian region, those that Israel was going to know about in the future. However, there's a lot of good arguments that back that up, and it's believable to some regard, but there are a couple of texts that point to the contrary, such as back in chapter 9 in verse 19. And let me just hasten to add here that not all the sons and grandsons and so forth are given, such as here in verse 2, Japheth begat Gomer, Magog, Madai, Javan, Tubal, Meshech, and Tyrus. Japheth had 7 sons. Then he picks only 2 of those sons, verse 3, Gomer, and verse 4, Javan, to give us their descendants. Now that doesn't mean that Magog, Madai, Tubal, Meshech, and Tyrus didn't have children, though. Didn't have sons or daughters or either one. Certainly they did. But he chooses not to pick those. In other words, it is all-inclusive, but your people like the Indians and the Eskimos, they are a branch of one of these names that are mentioned here. Now, it is absolutely impossible to determine which name these other groups of people have branched out from, such as the Aborigines of New Zealand. Now, they're entirely different than most other people, well, than everyone else in the world. And the Eskimos are a different racial group of people. But they branched off from one of these groups somewhere along the line, from whom we don't know and when we don't know. But back in 9:19, notice the language that is said. These are the three sons of Noah, and of them was the whole earth overspread. Now remember that the word earth in the Hebrew can be translated land, country, region, any of those things. It all depends upon the context where it's used. So that's one of the arguments against this passage. These are the three sons of Noah, and of them was the whole, region. Speaking of Mesopotamia, as well as North Africa, as well as Asia Minor, that general area overspread. But if you go back to chapter 10 and verse 32, when you take 10:32 with 9:19, it, to me anyway, appears that the table of nations here is all-inclusive. It includes everyone. Although they might not be mentioned specifically, they come into play somewhere here. These are the families. Now this is a summary of all that he said. These are the families of the sons of Noah after their generations in their nations, and by these were the nations divided in the earth after the flood. Now, since we know from our studies earlier that the whole earth, not just Mesopotamia, the whole earth was populated prior to the flood, since it's talking now about the population or the repopulation of the earth after the flood, it's probably talking about the whole globe. Now, if this was just a local flood and it just destroyed the people in that area, then, of course, our argument would be invalid for sure. But since the flood was universal, and especially since humanity was universal, as far as being all over the globe, then with this phrase here, and by these were the nations divided in the earth after the flood, he's trying to point out that the whole globe was populated after the flood. Not just translate the word earth as land or as country or as region and speak of the Iran-Iraq region. And besides that, of course, we know these people end up in North Africa, East Africa, Europe, southwestern Asia. So if you're going to translate it land or you're going to translate it region, that's just about the whole globe right there. I mean, you've taken up a huge, huge region there. It'd be one thing if we know that all the people, in other words, that are mentioned here in chapter 10 only ended up somewhere in Iran or Iraq. But that's not true, though. These people spread out hundreds and hundreds of miles from there, down to Africa, up into Europe, up into Asia. Now, of course, by these names here, we don't know of anyone that came to North America or South America or anything like that, but that's not included here. No doubt he's emphasizing the names. That's why some names of sons born to fathers aren't given. He's emphasizing the names that Israel would be familiar with in the future. Now, that doesn't mean that the table's not all-inclusive. It simply means that why go to the trouble of mentioning every son and every grandson when they're going to end up in North America and it's not going to involve Israel at all? So he is mentioning names that will involve Israel in the future, or at least that she will be aware of. So, that's about all we have to say about the names in chapter 10 as far as an introduction. Now, we have a lot to say about the names, but we'll have to do that next week. Okay, I said the second thing we wanted to do was to look at a summary of the purpose of the chapter. Why has God taken up 32 verses giving us this list of names? Okay, a summary of that. In the first place, it serves as a conclusion to the general history of the Bible and an introduction to the special history of the Bible. Now, what do we mean by that? Well, do you remember the outline for Genesis back in OT Intro, that the first 11 chapters are prehistoric, they deal with mankind in general, And then 12 through 50 of Genesis give a special history because it deals with the people of God. So what chapter 10 is doing is serving as a conclusion to the general history of man. It gives us all of these nations and all of these peoples. And at the same time as an introduction, because remember it ends with Shem, and that's why I said it ends with Shem, because it wants to lead right into Abram, and then right on into chapter 12 and 13 and 14 and so forth of Genesis. So it serves as a conclusion for one part of really the Bible, as well as Genesis, and an introduction to the next part, and the final part that's going to deal with the nation of Israel. Secondly, it complements the antediluvian list that we were given back in chapter 5. Now we have an antediluvian list of people in chapter 5, and now we have a postdiluvian list of people in chapter 10. Now some of the names are repeated, of course, over in chapter 11, but they are descendants from Shem. Furthermore, it explains for the biblical student the origin of the nations. People that want to study ethnography and ethnology want to try to get back and find out, now, how did we get all of these people here? Because your scientists that study in these fields and review the statistics and measure the height of people and the cc capacity of the skull for the brain and how fast they can run and the tint of the color of their skin and how their hair is shaped, whether it's always curly or always not curly, and the color of the eyes. They are really at a loss on finding out how we got all of this diversity. So for the student of Scriptures, God's given us a chart by which we can construct a reasonably suitable system for the formulation of the various groups of peoples and nationalities that we have today. All of that on the basis here of chapter 10. Then in the fourth place, if you'll turn over to Acts 17, I want to look at two very important texts. And you want to remember both of these texts now in light of Genesis 10. They just go hand in hand with Genesis 10. The Table of Nations serves to prove the biblical concept of the unity of the human race, which is one of those great questions studied by scientists and philosophers and so forth, the question of the unity of the human race. Acts 17:26a. Now the very first name in the list, remember, is Noah. There's no one really before him. Everyone's been wiped out. So he's one man. That's Genesis 10, verse 1. Noah's the first name that occurs in the list. And I said that chapter 10 serves to prove the biblical concept of the unity of the human race. Acts 17:26a, God hath made of one blood all nations of men for to dwell on all the face of the earth. You see, that scripture right there is speaking of Genesis chapter 10. God has made of one blood all nations. It's the table of nations, Genesis 10. That means that we all have one blood. We're all human beings. We're all part of the human race. And no one's really better than anyone else. Because you see, what people will do, the scientists that study this will try to find out now, is the black man inherently inferior to the white man? No. We all came from Adam. Now, if you live in a culture where you're not educated and where you serve many gods and you can fall backwards into so much sin and idolatry that you become such an ignorant people that it takes centuries for you to ever gain back what you had at one time, but that's not the question. We all realize that. Any fool realizes that. But is one race of people inherently better, superior to another race of people? No. Because we're all part of one race. It's the human race. You see, Hitler felt that the Aryan race was a superior race to all other people. The tall, 6'1", blonde-haired, blue-eyed Aryan race. And therefore it was his purpose in the Third Reich to annihilate every human on the face of the earth that was not of the Aryan race, thereby creating what he would call the super race of people, because he felt they were superior. Well, that's why we have to use this text here. No. No man inherently is superior to another man. Now, if you want to take all the black people in this country and give them a test and give all the white people are going to score better. Why? We've had centuries of better opportunities. But that doesn't mean we're inherently smarter or any better than the black man, than the Chinese man. Watch out for the Chinese and Japanese. Who do you think are the smartest mathematical people in the world? It's always these Chinese and Japanese people that are brilliant when it comes to mathematics, and we Americans just can't keep up with them. That's why they are the ones that give us our cars and transistor radios. We tried to figure out how in the world you're going to compress all that down into a little transistor radio. Well, they put their minds to work with their mathematical minds and figured out how that could be done. And so they're, of course, ruining the car industry in this country because they can do it better, cheaper, faster than we can do it, because they can think smarter and quicker and better than we can in that area of mathematics. But you see, we'd be better than them in a whole lot of other areas. So the concept of the unity of the human race is a biblical concept. You won't find it among races. You see, that's the one thing races argue against, is that the human race is not unified. Because if there is a unity in the human race, it means that we all start at the same level. It's just those that have been given over the centuries better and more available opportunities for education and for the upkeep of one's own social life and cultural life. Obviously, he'll end up in a better state of things a couple of centuries down the road. And it's just that we don't have enough time left in the world to prove it by educating the black people and showing you they are just as smart inherently as the white man. It's just they have not had the opportunity. And then finally, chapter 10 paves the way for the location of the most important of all nations. Now, I tell you what, we can stay right here, first of all, in Acts 17:26, but then there's a better Old Testament passage that is a remarkable text that is a commentary on Genesis chapter 10. I got to go back and find my place. Acts 17:26, I can quote it, but I'll go back there anyway. God hath made of one blood all nations of men for to dwell on all the face of the earth. So that's the unity of the human race. And hath determined the times before appointed and the bounds of their habitation. In other words, in God's eternal degree and decree of things, there was a particular region that was designated for particular people. That's the bounds of their habitation. And as far as him determining the times before appointed, a people in that area will only last so long. And God raises up one nation to put down another nation. But over in the end of the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 32, verses 7 through 10, we have a commentary on Genesis 10. And it shows just what I'm saying here for a summary of the purpose, that it paves the way for the location of the most important of all nations, which of course is the nation of Israel. So Moses in his song says, Deuteronomy 32:7, remember the days of old and consider the years of many generations. Ask thy father, and he will show thee, thy elders, and they will tell thee. Now he's speaking here of Genesis 10. Verse 8, when the Most High divided to the nations their inheritance, when he separated the sons of Adam, sons of Noah are the same thing as the sons of Adam because Noah came from Adam. He set the bounds of the people according to the number of the children of Israel. In other words, he gave all nations their allotted territory with Israel in mind in the future. You see, Israel doesn't exist now in Genesis 10. But Israel in the future is in his mind, and he's going to set the bound of all nations with his people in view in the future. For the Lord's portion is his people, Jacob is the lot of his inheritance. He found him in a desert land and in the waste howling wilderness. He led him about, he instructed him, and he kept him as the apple of his eye. So in verse 8 it says that the Most High divided the nations, that's Genesis 10, according to their inheritance. He separated the sons of Adam. He set the bounds of the people according to the number of the children of Israel. In other words, he knew that Israel was going to become just large enough to occupy a certain area. You see, the Russians couldn't live in Israel today. There are too many Russians to live there. The Americans couldn't live in Israel. But Israel can live in Israel. And Israel for centuries has been at a constant population. Now, they haven't always been at home. They've been abroad. But there have been about 3 million Israelites. I mean, there were about 3 million back with Moses' day. And there's always been about 3 million people. You can't end up with 100 million Israelites. They won't fit in Israel then. So there's a certain number of people that God has already determined that will fit in that area. And as a result, he's put all the other nations circling them. She's called the apple of his eye, the center of his attention, so that they won't conflict with Israel. Now, you say, well, what about, I think it's verse 19 of chapter 10. The border of the Canaanites was from Zidon, as thou comest to Gerar, and to Gaza, as thou goest into Sodom and Gomorrah, and Admah and Zeboim, even unto Lasha. This speaks of the region of Israel here. Well, those are the very people that God sent Israel in to destroy out of the land, were the Canaanites. So he was simply having the land all prepared for them. Whenever Moses and the people of God entered into the land, or Joshua after Moses, then God had already told them through Moses that you'll enter into a land and be able to partake of vineyards that you didn't have to plant, and olive trees that you didn't have to plant, which take years and years and years even to begin to produce. And before you get a heavy produce of olives from an olive tree, it takes many, many years, because they live to be centuries of years old. They live to be many, many years old. And he said you'll have cities that you didn't have to build that will belong to you. So he was preparing that land for them before they ever got there. It's just that a wicked group of people happened to live there. And of course that was the Canaanites, as well as some of their cousins, the Jebusites, the Amorites, the Girgasites, that Israel had to defeat whenever she went in. One comment I can make back on chapter 32 of Genesis is the fact that in the Septuagint we have a very, very strange translation there that no one really knows why it occurs. And that is, we have a substitution for the children of Israel in the end of verse 8. We have a substitution there with the phrase, the angels of God. He set the bounds of the people according to the number of the angels of God. But angels don't live in human territories. So don't let that throw you if you come across that somewhere on why the Septuagint has that. No one really knows why or how that got in there. But it should be children of Israel, because that's what Genesis 10 and 11 are setting forth for us to see. The fact that the preparation is already being made in advance for the nation of Israel. And as a result, you get a lot of fanciful interpretations that since it does mention nations in the beginning of verse 8, then every nation has its own guardian good angel that comes along with it. And he set the bounds of the people according to the number of their guardian angels. But that certainly doesn't seem to fit the context when what he's doing here in verse 7 is saying, now remember what God has done for you back from the very beginning. And he means in Genesis chapter 10. And he goes on to mention in verse 9, Jacob is the lot of his inheritance, not the angels. And he goes on in verse 10 that Jacob God kept as the apple of his eye, not the angels. So the angels of God appears to be some type of weird mistranslation or insertion by someone who didn't know what they were doing in Deuteronomy 32 and verse 8 that got into the Septuagint version. Okay, do we have enough time? I guess we got enough time to get started on something else. An outline for the Table of Nations. This is probably all we'll have time for tonight. An outline, very easy. We have an introduction, we have a body which has 3 parts, and we have a conclusion. Introduction, verse 1. Then the conclusion, verse 32. which means the body comprises verses 2 through 31. And it has 3 divisions in it. In the body of the material, we have the descendants of the Japhethites in verses 2 through 5. Hamites 6 through 20. Shemites 21 through 31. And also, the end of each of those divisions, verse 5, verse 20, and verse 31, serve as many conclusions to that section of the body. Then verse 32 is a conclusion to the whole thing. In other words, verse 5 is a conclusion for the Japhethite section, verse 20 is the conclusion for the Hamite section, and verse 31. They're all very similar. Verse 5, verse 20, verse 31 is a conclusion to the Shemite section. And then verse 32 is a conclusion to the whole chapter. Now in the chapter there are a couple of interruptions that occur within the body of the material, and we'll pick up with those next time then. So, you have any questions on just the material we covered? Now, don't ask something that we might be on next week, but do I need to repeat anything?
How do you define Caucasian?
Caucasian, we'll be getting to that in the future. That will be over with chapter 11. We won't even deal with that next week. We'll pick back up with that again in chapter 11, where we look at Caucasian and the Negroid people and see what those terms mean.
I don't know where it would pertain to, but when did the age of man get kind of put down to what year?
That's in the future too. When we cover the genealogies of chapter 11 and chapter 5, not here in 10, but chapter 11 and chapter 5, we'll do a whole study, a comparative study with some charts and everything of the relative ages before the flood, after the flood, and so forth, as well as the age when sons are born. Because, of course, it's different after the flood as compared to prior to the flood.
For a